Story number 1. The Whispers of Waverly Hills. When we first decided to explore Waverly Hills Sanatorium, it seemed like a great idea. It was supposed to be a thrill, a brush with the supernatural in one of the most haunted places in America. Haunted tours weren't enough for us, we wanted the real thing. No guides, no curated stories. Just us, the empty halls, and whatever ghosts were left behind. There were 5 of us, me, my girlfriend Anna, her best friend Claire, and 2 brothers we'd met in college, Mark and Danny. Mark was the daredevil, always pushing boundaries, while Danny was quieter, the reluctant tag-along. I like to think I was somewhere in between. When Mark suggested breaking into Waverly Hills late at night, I hesitated, but Anna was all in. "Come on," she said, her eyes bright with excitement. "It's just a building. What's the worst that could happen?" The sanatorium loomed above us as we climbed the hill, a hulking silhouette against the starless sky. Its windows were dark and empty, like the eyes of a skull, and the air seemed colder as we approached. The stories about Waverly Hills were infamous. Thousands of patients had died here during the tuberculosis epidemic in the early 20th century. The hospital was a factory for death, and its history was steeped in suffering. People claimed to hear footsteps in empty corridors, see shadowy figures in the windows, and, of course, hear the whispers. We found a broken window near the loading dock and slipped inside, our flashlights cutting weak beams through the darkness. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay, and every step echoed unnaturally, as if the building were swallowing the sound. The main hall stretched ahead of us, its peeling walls lined with broken gurneys and rusted wheelchairs. "Creepy as hell," Mark said, grinning. "This is going to be awesome." We started on the first floor, moving cautiously through the abandoned wards. The graffiti-covered walls were scrawled with names, dates, and ominous warnings. "Don't look back. They're watching. Leave while you can." At first, it felt like any other urban exploration trip, exciting but ultimately harmless. But as we moved deeper into the building, the atmosphere changed. The air grew heavier, and the silence wasn't just an absence of sound, it was oppressive, like something alive. It began with the whispers. We were on the second floor when I heard my name, faint and distant, carried on a breath of cold air. I stopped, shining my flashlight down the hall. "Did you hear that?" I asked. The others paused, exchanging uneasy glances. "Hear what?" Anna said. "Someone said my name," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. Mark laughed nervously. "The ghosts already like you." We kept moving, but the whispers followed us. Each of us began hearing our names, soft and urgent, as if someone was just out of sight, calling us toward them. Claire clung to Anna, her wide eyes darting toward every shadow. "I don't like this," she muttered. "It's just the wind," Mark said, though his bravado was fading. Danny stayed silent, his flashlight shaking slightly in his hand. We reached the emergency room on the 3rd floor, its doors hanging crookedly on rusted hinges. The air was colder here, biting at our skin, and the whispers grew louder, overlapping in a cacophony of voices. The room was a wreck, broken beds, shattered glass, and medical tools scattered across the floor. On one wall, written in dark, smeared letters, were the words, "They never left." That's when the door slammed shut. We jumped, spinning around to see the heavy door sealed tight. Mark ran to it, yanking on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "This isn't funny," he shouted, but no one was laughing. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, as if the walls themselves were speaking. Then the lights flickered, brief flashes of dim light that illuminated the room in stuttering intervals. In one of those flashes, we saw them. They stood in the corners, shadowy figures with hollow eyes and skeletal frames. They didn't move, didn't speak, just stared, their presence suffocating. Anna screamed, grabbing my arm, and I felt my own breath catch in my throat. Mark banged on the door, shouting for help, but the figures didn't react. They just stared. The lights went out completely, plunging us into darkness. The whispers stopped, replaced by a suffocating silence. Then, one by one, the flashlights died. I don't know how long we stood there, paralyzed by fear, but eventually, the door creaked open. The hall was empty, the shadows gone. Without a word, we ran. We didn't make it far. The building's layout seemed to shift around us, the halls looping back on themselves no matter which direction we turned. Rooms we'd already explored appeared unfamiliar, and the graffiti on the walls changed, the warnings becoming more specific. Don't leave us. Stay forever. You're next. And then Mark was gone. One moment he was with us, the next he wasn't. His flashlight lay on the ground, still warm to the touch, but there was no sign of him. We called his name, our voices echoing down the empty halls, but there was no response. Anna sobbed, clutching my hand, and Danny stood frozen, his face pale and blank. We have to find him, Claire said, though her voice trembled. But every turn led us back to the emergency room. The figures were waiting, their numbers growing. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, and I realized they weren't just calling to us, they were calling us in. They wanted us to stay, to join them. Anna's grip on my hand tightened, and she whispered, "Don't let them take me." Her voice broke something in me, and I pulled her close, determined to get her out no matter what. We ran again, retracing our steps, but the halls didn't make sense anymore. Danny disappeared next, his scream echoing briefly before being swallowed by silence. Claire was crying openly now, her voice hoarse as she begged us to leave her behind. "We're not leaving anyone," I said, though I didn't believe my own words. We reached the main hall just as the sun began to rise. The whispers faded, and the shadows melted away as the first light of dawn seeped through the broken windows. Anna and I stumbled outside, gasping for air, the cool morning breeze a relief against our burning lungs. Mark, Danny, and Claire never made it out. The police didn't believe us. They said it was an accident, that the building was unstable, that our friends must have fallen or gotten lost in the chaos. But I know the truth. Waverly Hills doesn't let everyone leave. The sanatorium is alive, feeding on the fear and despair of those foolish enough to enter. And the whispers? They're still with me. Every night, as I try to sleep, I hear my name, soft and urgent, calling me back to Waverly Hills. I know one day I'll have to answer. Story number 2. The Shadow Beneath. Danvers State Hospital sat on the hill like a scar, its Gothic spires stabbing at the sky. Even in its decay, the building exuded authority, a grim reminder of its past. Built in the 19th century as a haven for the mentally ill, it quickly became infamous for its brutal treatments, electroshock therapy, lobotomies, and solitary confinement. Over the years, rumors of abuse, death, and unspeakable experiments seeped out, painting Danvers as a monument to human suffering. By the time it closed in the 1990s, it was less a hospital and more a mausoleum. As a journalist, I'd always been drawn to stories others avoided, and Danvers was irresistible. The hospital had been abandoned for decades, left to rot and crumble, but its reputation had only grown. People whispered about screams in the night, ghostly apparitions, and a darkness that seemed to live within its walls. When I pitched the idea to my editor, a deep dive into the history of Danvers, he was skeptical but intrigued. "Just don't get yourself killed," he'd said, only half joking. I arrived on a cold November morning, the sky gray and heavy. The grounds were overgrown, the once manicured lawns now a tangle of weeds and brambles. The main building loomed ahead, its windows shattered, its facade streaked with grime. The air smelled of damp earth and mildew, and every step felt heavier, as if the place itself didn't want me there. The entrance was boarded up, but I found a side door that had been pried open, likely by urban explorers. Inside, the air was colder, thick with the scent of decay. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, illuminating peeling wallpaper, rusted gurneys, and graffiti scrawled across the walls. "Leave while you can. They're still here." The words were unsettling, but I reminded myself that they were the work of thrill seekers, not ghosts. I spent hours wandering the upper floors, documenting the crumbling infrastructure and collecting notes for my article. The patient rooms were small and claustrophobic, their walls etched with desperate carvings, names, dates, fragments of prayers. The isolation rooms were worse, their padded walls rotting away to reveal stains that I didn't want to think about. It was grim, but nothing I hadn't expected. Then I found the staircase to the basement. It was hidden behind a heavy metal door, its hinges rusted but functional. The stairs descended into darkness, the air growing colder with every step. A sense of unease settled over me, but curiosity pushed me forward. My flashlight illuminated the narrow corridor below, the walls lined with pipes that dripped with condensation. The floor was slick, the air heavy with the scent of mildew and something metallic, blood, perhaps, though I told myself it was rust. At the end of the hall, I found the door. It was heavy, reinforced with steel, and bore no identifying marks. A thick chain secured it, but the padlock was broken, the chain hanging loosely. My pulse quickened as I pushed the door open, revealing a small, windowless room. The walls were covered in carvings, intricate and chaotic, spiraling patterns that seemed to shift and writhe in the dim light. They weren't like the graffiti upstairs, these were deliberate, obsessive, etched deep into the concrete. In the center of the room stood a single chair, bolted to the floor. Straps dangled from its arms, frayed and stained. It looked like something out of an execution chamber, and the sight of it sent a chill down my spine. But it was the shadows that caught my attention. They were wrong. The room was lit only by my flashlight, but the shadows didn't behave as they should. They stretched and shifted unnaturally, moving against the beam's direction. One in particular, a dark shape on the far wall, seemed to pulse as if alive. I stepped closer, my breath fogging in the cold air, and reached out to touch the wall. The instant my fingers brushed the concrete, my flashlight flickered and died. I froze, swallowed by darkness. The air grew colder, and I felt something move behind me, a faint, almost imperceptible shift. My hands fumbled with the flashlight, shaking as I smacked it against my palm. The beam sputtered back to life, and I turned it toward the chair. The shadow was no longer on the wall. It stood in the center of the room, tall and amorphous, its edges shifting like smoke. My heart pounded as I backed away, my flashlight trembling in my grip. The shadow didn't follow, but it moved, its form undulating as if it were struggling to maintain its shape. And then I heard it, a voice, low and guttural, whispering words I couldn't understand. I bolted, my footsteps echoing in the corridor as I raced up the stairs. The building seemed to close in around me, the air thick with an oppressive weight. By the time I burst outside, gasping for breath, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the grounds. But I didn't feel safe. Not yet. I spent the night in a motel, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. I reviewed my photos, hoping for answers, but what I found only deepened my fear. In every image of the basement room, the shadow was there, growing closer with each frame. And in the final photo, taken just before my flashlight died, the shadow wasn't on the wall or the floor. It was standing behind me. The next morning, I returned to Danvers with a crowbar and a can of gasoline. I didn't care about the article anymore. I just wanted to destroy whatever was in that basement, to erase the carvings and burn the shadow into oblivion. But when I reached the building, the door to the basement was gone. The staircase, the corridor, the room, they no longer existed. The walls were smooth, unbroken, as if the basement had never been there at all. I left Danvers that day, vowing never to return. But the shadow hasn't left me. I see it in my dreams, in the corners of my vision, in the dark spaces where light doesn't reach. It whispers to me, calling me back to that room, promising answers I don't want to hear. Danvers was a place of pain, a vessel for suffering, and some of that darkness has seeped into the walls, into the very fabric of the building. If you ever find yourself drawn to its ruins, remember this: some shadows aren't cast by light. And once they see you, they never let go. Story number 3. The Endless Corridor. I've always been a sucker for abandoned places. The peeling paint, the broken windows, the eerie silence, it's like walking through a graveyard of forgotten stories. So when I found myself in Williamsburg, Virginia, with nothing to do on a cold November night, it wasn't long before I was standing outside the gates of Eastern State Hospital. The hospital was one of the oldest mental institutions in the country, dating back to the 1700s. Its history was a mess of inhumane treatments, overcrowding, and countless deaths. When it finally closed, locals started whispering about strange occurrences, lights flickering in the empty windows, voices echoing through the halls, shadows moving where no one should be. It was exactly the kind of place I couldn't resist. The gate was rusted but unlocked, creaking on its hinges as I slipped through. The main building loomed ahead, its brick facade weathered and cracked, its windows dark. The air was colder here, the kind of chill that sinks into your bones and makes your skin crawl. I told myself it was just the temperature, but deep down, I knew better. The front doors were boarded up, but a broken window to the left provided easy access. I climbed through, my boots crunching on shattered glass, and flicked on my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a long, empty hallway. The walls were lined with faded murals, scenes of flowers and sunshine, meant to soothe the patients but now peeling and grotesque. The air smelled of mildew and something metallic, like rust or blood. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of my own footsteps. I walked slowly, my flashlight sweeping from side to side, revealing doors hanging crookedly on their hinges, empty gurneys, and the occasional wheelchair, its wheels frozen with rust. The further I went, the heavier the air seemed to grow, as if the building itself were alive, pressing down on me. I reached the end of the hallway and found a staircase leading down. The basement, I thought. That's where the real history would be, the electroshock therapy rooms, the solitary confinement cells, the morgue. I descended cautiously, the stairs creaking under my weight, and found myself in another hallway, nearly identical to the one above. It was longer than it should have been. Much longer. I kept walking, my unease growing with each step. The walls were the same faded brick, the same peeling murals. The doors were spaced at irregular intervals, their numbers rusted and illegible. I tried one, but it wouldn't budge. Another was locked as well. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly ahead, the far end swallowed by darkness. After what felt like an hour of walking, I stopped. Something wasn't right. I turned to look back the way I had come, but the hallway behind me was just as long, just as dark. I was sure I hadn't walked that far. My heart began to race, my breath coming in short, shallow bursts. The silence pressed against my ears, and then I heard it. Footsteps. They were faint at first, a soft tapping echoing in the distance. I turned, shining my flashlight down the hallway, but there was nothing there. The sound grew louder, closer, steady and deliberate. My grip on the flashlight tightened as I backed away, my mind racing. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The footsteps stopped. The silence returned, heavier than before, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I turned and started walking faster, my boots echoing in the empty hall. I reached a corner and turned, only to find myself in another identical corridor. The same walls, the same doors, the same oppressive darkness. Panic set in as I began to run. I turned corner after corner, my flashlight bouncing wildly, but the hallway never changed. It was as if I were running in circles, though I knew that wasn't possible. The footsteps started again, louder now, as if whoever, or whatever, was following me had quickened their pace. I stopped and spun around, the beam of my flashlight slicing through the darkness, but there was still nothing there. Then I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, just at the edge of the light, was a figure. It was tall and thin, its limbs impossibly long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its eyes, if they were eyes, reflected the light like a predator's in the dark. It didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel its gaze, heavy and unrelenting. I turned and ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my legs burning with effort. The hallway stretched endlessly ahead, the doors and walls blurring together as I sprinted. The footsteps behind me grew faster, heavier, and the air filled with a low, guttural whisper, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "You can't leave." The words weren't spoken so much as felt, vibrating through my skull, sinking into my bones. I turned a corner and froze. The figure was there, standing in the center of the hallway, closer than before. Its head tilted further, its limbs twitching as it took a step toward me. I stumbled backward, dropping my flashlight, the beam spinning wildly as it hit the floor. In the chaos, I saw something carved into the wall, words etched deep into the brick, as if by desperate hands. "The corridor never ends." Below it, another message, "We are still here." I grabbed the flashlight and ran again, tears streaming down my face, my mind racing with fear and confusion. No matter how far I ran, how many turns I took, the hallway remained the same. The figure was always there, waiting, watching, whispering. Eventually, I collapsed, my body unable to go on. The whispers grew louder, enveloping me, until they were the only thing I could hear. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was the figure standing over me, its empty eyes burning into mine. I don't know how I got out. I woke up outside the hospital, lying in the cold grass, my flashlight still clutched in my hand. The sun was rising, the first rays of light piercing the gray sky. My car was still parked where I'd left it, and the hospital stood silent and empty behind me. But something was different. The hallway hasn't left me. Every night, in my dreams, I'm back there, running through the endless corridor, the whispers echoing around me. Sometimes I hear the footsteps. Sometimes I see the figure. And every time, I wake up gasping, drenched in sweat, the feeling of its gaze still burning on my skin. I tried to warn others, to tell them to stay away, but they don't believe me. They think it's just a story, just another legend about an abandoned asylum. But I know the truth. The hallway is real, and it's waiting for someone else to step inside. If you ever find yourself near Eastern State Hospital, don't go in. Don't follow the curiosity that tells you it's just an empty building. Because once you enter, the corridor won't let you leave. And you'll run and run until there's nothing left of you but the whispers. Story number 4. Room 13. The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum had always been a magnet for ghost hunters, thrill seekers, and the curious. Its crumbling walls held decades of pain and suffering, whispers of lobotomies, violent outbursts, and the relentless wails of the damned. For someone like me, an urban explorer and amateur documentarian, it was irresistible. I arrived on a chilly October afternoon, the kind of day when the sun seemed hesitant to shine. The asylum stood like a stone giant against the gray sky, its Gothic architecture both beautiful and foreboding. The stories I'd read painted it as a place of torment, a warehouse for the unwanted and misunderstood. Patients who had been labeled insane were locked away in darkness, many of them forgotten by the world outside. I wasn't here for the stories, though. I was here to see it for myself, to capture the desolation on camera. The main tours were sanitized, scripted for tourists, and I wanted something raw. That's why I waited until nightfall, sneaking in through a broken basement window, my gear packed tight in a backpack. The halls were a labyrinth of decay and darkness. My flashlight cut through the gloom, revealing long corridors of peeling paint, rusted gurneys, and graffiti scrawled in desperate, angry letters. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and rot, and every step echoed too loudly, as if the asylum itself were listening. I wandered for hours, documenting everything. The isolation rooms were small and suffocating, their padded walls torn and stained. The common areas were littered with debris, broken chairs, faded books, and even a child's doll with one missing eye. It was haunting, but nothing I hadn't expected. Then I found the door to room 13. It was in a wing I didn't recognize, tucked away behind a series of twisting corridors. The door was heavy steel, scratched and battered, with the number 13 painted in faded red. Chains wrapped around the handles, secured with a rusted padlock, as though someone had gone to great lengths to keep whatever was inside from getting out. A chill ran down my spine as I approached, the beam of my flashlight trembling. I should have turned back. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but curiosity is a powerful thing. I set my camera on a nearby chair, aimed at the door, and dug into my bag for the bolt cutters I always carried. It took more effort than I expected, the padlock resisting as if it were alive, but eventually the chains fell away, clattering to the floor. The door groaned open, and the air that spilled out was colder than the rest of the asylum. My flashlight revealed a small, windowless room. A single iron bed sat bolted to the floor, its mattress thin and yellowed. Leather straps hung limply from the frame, their buckles rusted, their purpose clear. The walls were covered in scratches, deep gouges that crisscrossed the surface like frantic scribbles. But it was the stains that drew my attention, dark smears that trailed from the bed to the floor, dried and flaking but unmistakably blood. A sudden wave of nausea hit me, the metallic scent sharp and overwhelming. I backed away, my flashlight sweeping the room, and that's when I saw the writing. It was faint, carved into the headboard of the bed, "He waits." I wanted to leave. I turned back to the door, but it was no longer there. The hallway, the chair, my camera, all gone. The walls now closed around me, the room impossibly small. Panic surged as I pounded on the walls, shouting for help, but the only response was my own echo. And then the whisper started. It was soft at first, almost too faint to hear. A low, raspy voice, speaking words I couldn't understand. It grew louder, more insistent, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. My flashlight flickered, the beam dimming as the room plunged into shadow. I turned, and that's when I saw it. The shadow moved. At first, it was just a blur, a flicker in the corner of my vision. But it grew, stretching across the walls, taking shape. It was a man, or the suggestion of one, tall and gaunt, his limbs elongated, his face a featureless void. The straps on the bed creaked as if something heavy were lying there, and the air grew colder, freezing my breath into clouds. The whisper became a growl. "You came," it said, the words slithering into my ears like smoke. "You freed me." I backed into the corner, clutching my flashlight like a weapon. "I didn't mean to," I shouted, my voice cracking. The shadow laughed, a deep, guttural sound that rattled my teeth. "You opened the door. Now you will stay." The walls seemed to close in, the room spinning as the shadows enveloped me. I tried to move, to escape, but my legs felt heavy, as though the air itself were holding me down. The bed groaned, the straps writhing like snakes, and I realized with a sickening dread that they were reaching for me. When I woke, I was lying on the floor outside the room. The door was shut, the chains wrapped tightly around it once again. My camera was gone, my bag missing, but I didn't care. I ran, stumbling through the asylum, the hallways a blur until I found the broken window and climbed out into the cold night air. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, my hands trembling so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. The drive home was a haze, my mind racing with what I'd seen, what I'd heard. I tried to tell myself it was a hallucination, a trick of the mind brought on by fear and isolation. But the scratches on my arms, the bruises on my wrists, and the faint smell of mildew and blood that clung to me told a different story. I never went back to Trans-Allegheny, and I never spoke about Room 13. But sometimes, late at night, I hear it, the whisper, faint and raspy, calling my name. And I know that the shadow is waiting, still locked in that room, still hungry for the next curious soul who dares to open the door. If you ever find yourself exploring the asylum, and you come across a chained door with the number 13, do yourself a favor, turn around and leave. Because once you open it, you might not be able to close it again. Story number 5. The blood on the ceiling. Penhurst Asylum was the kind of place that existed more as a ghost than a building. It loomed in local legends, the stories passed down like warnings, tales of tortured patients, screams echoing through empty halls, and shadows moving where no one should be. For years, the asylum had sat abandoned, a decaying reminder of the horrors that had unfolded there. And like moths to a flame, my girlfriend Emily and I couldn't resist its pull. We weren't thrill seekers or ghost hunters. We just wanted to see it for ourselves, to step inside the stories and touch a piece of history. It was a cloudy afternoon in October when we arrived, the air thick with the scent of fallen leaves and impending rain. The asylum loomed ahead, its brick facade cracked and streaked with grime, the windows dark and lifeless. The gates were chained, but the rusted lock had been broken long ago. The air grew colder as we stepped inside, the oppressive silence broken only by the crunch of debris underfoot. The main hall stretched ahead, a cavernous space littered with broken furniture, shattered glass, and graffiti. Emily clung to my arm, her eyes wide as she scanned the shadows. "Creepy doesn't even begin to cover it," she whispered. I nodded, my own unease growing with every step. We wandered for a while, moving cautiously through the asylum's twisting corridors. The walls were lined with peeling paint and faded signs, isolation ward. Occupational therapy. No entry. Each room we passed told a story of neglect and despair, from the rusted gurneys to the crumbling wheelchairs left to rot in the corners. But it wasn't until we reached the east wing that we found the ceiling. The room was small, its walls covered in faded wallpaper that might have once been cheerful. A broken bed frame lay in the center, its mattress missing, and the air smelled of mildew and something metallic. At first, it seemed like any other room in the asylum, until Emily pointed her flashlight upward. The ceiling was covered in writing. The words were scrawled in dark, rusty streaks that dripped down the walls, forming jagged lines and looping patterns. Help us. They hurt us. Don't leave us here. The phrases overlapped and intertwined, creating a chaotic web of desperation. Is that blood? Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. We both knew the answer. As we stared, the air seemed to grow heavier, and a faint whisper filled the room. It wasn't coming from outside or the hallway. It was inside our heads, soft and insistent, like a memory surfacing from deep within. Emily clutched my arm, her face pale. Do you hear that? She asked. I nodded, my throat too dry to speak. Then the images began. It started as flashes, brief and disjointed, like an old film reel flickering to life. A young girl, no older than 10, strapped to a chair as a man in a white coat adjusted a machine. Her screams filled the room, her body convulsing as electricity coursed through her. The image vanished, replaced by another, a boy, thin and gaunt, huddled in a corner as shadows moved toward him, their hands reaching, grabbing. Each line of writing brought a new vision, more vivid and horrifying than the last. A woman crying as her head was shaved. A man clawing at the walls of a padded cell, his fingernails broken and bleeding. A nurse holding a syringe, her expression cold and detached as a patient pleaded for mercy. Emily dropped her flashlight, her hands clutching her head. Make it stop, she cried, her voice breaking. I tried to pull her away, but my own feet felt rooted to the spot. The whispers grew louder, the images more relentless, until it felt like the room itself was alive, pulsating with the agony of the past. And then, it all stopped. The room was silent again, the air still and heavy. Emily was trembling, tears streaming down her face. We need to get out of here, she said, her voice shaking. I nodded, grabbing her hand and pulling her toward the door. But the asylum had other plans. The hallway we'd come from was gone, replaced by another, longer and darker. The walls seemed to close in as we ran, each turn leading us deeper into the building's labyrinthine depths. The whispers returned, louder now, calling our names, begging us to come back. The ceiling in every room we passed was the same, covered in the same desperate writing, the same cries for help. Emily stumbled, her knees hitting the floor. I can't do this, she gasped, her voice hoarse. I grabbed her arm, pulling her to her feet. We're almost there, I lied, though I had no idea where there was. The shadows on the walls began to move, flickering and stretching as if alive. And then, I saw them. The patients. They were pale and thin, their hospital gowns hanging loosely on skeletal frames. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes hollow, their mouths moving soundlessly. They reached for us, their hands clawing at the air, their expressions a mix of sorrow and rage. One of them stepped forward, a woman with a shaved head and empty eyes, her lips forming a single word, stay. I pulled Emily through the nearest door, slamming it shut behind us. We were in another room, identical to the one with the ceiling. The writing was there, dripping and fresh, the whispers growing deafening. Emily sank to the floor, her hands covering her ears, her eyes squeezed shut. They won't let us leave, she sobbed. They want us to stay. Desperation took over. I grabbed a chair, throwing it at the window, but the glass didn't break. The walls seemed to pulse, the writing glowing faintly in the dim light. The whispers became screams, overlapping and chaotic, and the room felt smaller, the air too thick to breathe. I don't remember how we got out. One moment, we were in that room, and the next, we were outside, stumbling into the cold night air. The asylum loomed behind us, dark and silent, as if nothing had happened. Emily clung to me, her breath ragged, her face streaked with tears. We didn't speak as we got into the car and drove away, the headlights cutting through the darkness. It's been weeks since that night, but the asylum hasn't left us. Emily wakes up screaming, her dreams filled with the faces of the patients. I see the writing in every shadow, hear the whispers in every silence. The memories we saw aren't just memories, they're alive, clawing at the edges of our minds, refusing to let go. If you ever find yourself near Penhurst Asylum, don't go inside. Don't look at the ceiling, don't read the writing, and for the love of God, don't listen to the whispers. Because once you do, they become a part of you. And no matter how far you run, they'll never stop calling you back. Story number 6. The Lullaby at Rolling Hills. Night shifts at Rolling Hills Asylum were supposed to be easy. The place was old, abandoned, and falling apart, but my job as a night guard wasn't about protecting it from intruders. No one in their right mind would come here after dark. It was more about keeping the illusion alive for the Preservation Society that wanted to save the building, a reminder of a dark history most people preferred to forget. I didn't mind the quiet. The building was massive, sprawling over acres of land, its halls long and echoing. Most of the time, I'd walk my rounds, checking that the doors were still locked and no vandals had slipped in. But every so often, something would happen that reminded me why people whispered about this place. The stories, the shadows moving in empty hallways, the phantom footsteps, the crying that seemed to come from nowhere, had a way of creeping into your mind when the lights flickered and the wind howled. But nothing prepared me for the singing. It was a cold December night, the kind where the wind cuts through your jacket and turns your breath to fog. The building groaned in the chill, the old pipes clanking somewhere deep in its guts. I was making my usual rounds, my flashlight sweeping across the crumbling walls and scattered debris, when I heard it, a soft, lilting melody drifting through the air. At first, I thought it was the wind. It had that eerie, almost melodic quality as it moved through the cracks in the old building. But as I walked closer to the source, it became unmistakable. It was a voice, soft, feminine, singing a lullaby. The words were indistinct, the melody hauntingly beautiful and utterly out of place. The sound was coming from the children's wing. I hesitated. I'd walked through that wing countless times, its tiny beds and faded murals a heartbreaking reminder of the asylum's past. It had been a place for orphans and children whose families couldn't or wouldn't care for them. Most of them never left. The thought of going in there now, with that voice echoing in the darkness, sent a chill down my spine. But duty was duty, and I couldn't just ignore it. The hallway leading to the children's wing was colder than the rest of the building. My breath fogged in the beam of my flashlight, the walls lined with crumbling plaster and rusted pipes. The singing grew louder as I approached, the melody twisting in ways that made my stomach churn. It wasn't just a lullaby, it was wrong, dissonant, like a record played at the wrong speed. When I reached the door to the ward, it creaked open on its own, the sound echoing through the empty hall. The room beyond was just as I remembered it, rows of tiny beds, their metal frames rusted, the mattresses long gone. But something was different. The air felt heavy, charged, and the faint scent of lavender, too fresh, too out of place, filled my nose. I stepped inside, my flashlight sweeping across the room. The beds were empty, but the blankets, those thin, scratchy hospital-issue ones, were pulled neatly to the tops of the frames, as if waiting for their occupants to return. And the lullaby, it was louder now, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Then I noticed the warmth. The beds closest to me were warm to the touch, as if someone had just been lying in them. My pulse quickened, my breath catching in my throat. This wasn't right. This wasn't normal. I turned to leave, but as I did, the singing stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing against my ears like a weight. That's when I saw her. She stood at the far end of the ward, her figure illuminated by the pale light streaming through a broken window. She wore a nurse's uniform, the fabric pristine despite the decay around her, her hair tucked neatly beneath a cap. Her face was pale, her eyes dark hollows that seemed to swallow the light. In her hands, she held a small, tattered doll. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice soft and lilting, the same tone as the lullaby. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. My flashlight flickered, casting her face in shifting shadows that made her features seem to twist and change. "They were in so much pain," she continued, her tone almost apologetic. "I only wanted to help." The room seemed to grow darker, the walls closing in. I stepped back, my legs trembling, but she didn't follow. Instead, she tilted her head, her lips curving into a sad smile. "They were suffering," she said. "So I sang to them. I made it easier." The smell of lavender grew stronger, almost suffocating, and I realized it was coming from her. My flashlight died completely, plunging the room into darkness. Panic surged as I fumbled for my radio, but the static that crackled through it was drowned out by the sound of the lullaby, louder and more discordant than before. Then came the laughter. It started as a soft giggle, high-pitched and childlike, echoing through the ward. More voices joined in, overlapping, rising into a chorus that was anything but joyful. The sound was wrong, sharp and grating, like nails on a chalkboard. I turned toward the door, desperate to escape, but it slammed shut with a force that shook the walls. I don't remember much of what happened next. The room seemed to shift, the walls melting into shadow, the air filled with the sounds of crying, laughter, and that cursed lullaby. I ran, my heart pounding, my lungs burning, the darkness pressing against me like a living thing. Somehow, I made it out, stumbling into the freezing night air, my legs buckling beneath me. I quit the next day. No explanation, no 2 weeks' notice. I just packed my things and left, vowing never to set foot in Rolling Hills again. But it didn't end there. The lullaby followed me. At night, as I lay in bed, I'd hear it faintly, drifting through the walls. The smell of lavender would creep into my room, clinging to my skin, my clothes. And in the corners of my vision, I'd see her, the nurse, her hollow eyes watching, waiting. Rolling Hills is more than just a relic of the past. It's a wound, festering with the pain and suffering of those who lived and died within its walls. And the nurse, she's still there, still singing, still helping in her own twisted way. If you ever find yourself near Rolling Hills, don't go in. Don't listen to the stories, don't follow the curiosity that tells you it's just an old building. Because once you hear the lullaby, it never lets you go. Story number 7. The Files of Tomorrow. The Hudson River State Hospital had always fascinated me. As a historian, I'd spent years diving into the stories of old asylums, peeling back the layers of time to uncover the truths buried beneath the sensationalized tales of horror and hauntings. Hudson River, with its Gothic architecture and tragic past, was one of the crown jewels of such places, a crumbling monument to the failures of early mental health care. When I finally had the chance to visit, I couldn't resist. The hospital had been abandoned for decades, its windows broken, its halls silent except for the whispers of the wind. Getting permission to explore was a bureaucratic nightmare, but after months of wrangling, I secured a day pass from the local historical society to document what was left before further renovations wiped away its darker history. Armed with a camera, a flashlight, and a notebook, I stepped into the hospital on a crisp October morning. The air inside was colder than it should have been, heavy with the scent of mildew and decay. My footsteps echoed in the cavernous halls as I wandered, my flashlight casting long shadows across graffiti-covered walls and rusted gurneys. Every corner of the building felt steeped in sorrow, the weight of forgotten lives pressing down on me. It was on the second floor, in a wing labeled Administration, that I found the door. It was tucked away at the end of a long corridor, its faded sign barely legible, Records Room. The door itself was wooden, scarred with scratches and gouges, as if someone, or something, had tried desperately to get in. Or out. It was locked, but the old mechanisms were no match for the crowbar I'd brought along. With a satisfying crack, the door creaked open, revealing the room beyond. The smell hit me first, stale air mixed with the faint tang of old paper. Shelves lined the walls, packed with file boxes and loose documents, their edges yellowed and brittle with age. A metal desk sat in the center, its surface cluttered with scattered papers and a rusted typewriter. The room felt untouched, preserved in a way that seemed impossible. It was as if time had stopped here, the chaos frozen mid-motion. I couldn't believe my luck. This was a treasure trove of history, a glimpse into the inner workings of the hospital, its patients, and its staff. I pulled out my phone and began snapping photos, careful not to disturb anything too much. Then I noticed the folder on the desk. It was thicker than the others, its label smudged but still legible, Special Cases. My curiosity flared. Special cases? The phrase was tantalizingly vague, a mystery waiting to be solved. I opened the folder, careful not to tear the delicate pages, and began reading. The first few entries were unsettling, detailing experimental treatments conducted on patients labeled as unresponsive or incorrigible. Electroshock therapy, lobotomies, chemical cocktails, barbaric methods dressed up as science. The dates ranged from the 1930s to the 1960s, and each report ended with a single line stamped in bold, "Case closed." Then I turned to the next page and froze. My name was there. It wasn't just my name, it was everything. My date of birth, my address, my occupation, even the reason for my visit to the hospital. The report was dated for tomorrow, and it described events that hadn't happened yet. Subject entered restricted area without authorization. Subject exhibited signs of paranoia and distress. Subject terminated at 11:47 p.m. My heart pounded as I stared at the page, my mind racing. This had to be a mistake. Someone's idea of a sick joke. But the handwriting matched the rest of the file, the paper was aged and brittle, and the ink had the same faded quality. It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. I slammed the folder shut, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The room felt colder now, the air heavy and oppressive. I had to leave. Whatever this was, it wasn't worth staying for. I turned toward the door and stopped. It was closed. I didn't remember closing it. I crossed the room, my flashlight trembling in my grip, and reached for the handle. It wouldn't budge. I twisted harder, yanking at it with all my strength, but it was as if the door were welded shut. Panic surged as I banged on the wood, shouting for help, but the only response was the muffled sound of my own voice echoing back at me. The papers rustled. I turned, the beam of my flashlight sweeping the room. The air was still, but the papers on the desk fluttered as if caught in a breeze. The typewriter clacked, a single key pressing down with an audible click. Then another. And another. The machine began typing on its own, the keys moving with a furious rhythm. I stepped closer, my legs shaking, and saw the words appearing on the page, "You were not supposed to find this." I stumbled back, my chest tightening as the typewriter continued, the keys hammering out the words faster and faster. "Now you must stay. Now you must stay. Now you must stay." The light in the room flickered, and the shelves groaned as if under some unbearable weight. Shadows pooled in the corners, long and twisting, reaching toward me with tendrils of darkness. The papers on the desk began to move, their edges curling as if burned, the ink bleeding across the pages. And then the whispering started. It came from everywhere and nowhere, a chorus of voices overlapping, murmuring my name, pleading, laughing, screaming. I clutched my ears, backing into the corner, my flashlight flickering wildly. The shadows closed in, the room shrinking around me, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. "You're next. You're next. You're next." I don't remember how I got out. One moment, I was in that room, the shadows pressing against me, the whispers drowning me. The next, I was outside, stumbling into the daylight, my clothes damp with sweat, my hands trembling. The hospital loomed behind me, dark and silent, as if daring me to return. I didn't. I left Hudson River that day, driving until I was miles away, until the whispers faded from my ears. But the file, the one with my name, it wasn't just a nightmare. I can still see it in my mind, the details too exact, too real. And every night, as the clock ticks closer to 11:47 p.m., I feel the weight of that report pressing down on me. I don't know what will happen when the time comes. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. But I know one thing for sure, the hospital isn't just a relic of the past. It's alive, recording, watching, and waiting. If you ever find yourself in Hudson River State Hospital, don't go looking for the records room. Don't open the files. Because once your name is written, it can never be erased. Story number 8. The Last Patient. Charity Hospital stood like a wounded giant in the heart of New Orleans, abandoned but not forgotten. It had weathered nearly 2 centuries of storms, floods, and the silent march of time. Once a beacon of care for the city's poorest residents, its halls were now empty, its walls peeling, the air thick with the weight of forgotten suffering. When Hurricane Cleo made landfall, the city braced for chaos. I, however, found myself trapped in the one place I swore I'd never set foot in again. I wasn't supposed to be there. The hospital had been abandoned since Hurricane Katrina, its patients and staff relocated elsewhere. But I was a traveling nurse on my first week in New Orleans, and when the storm warnings turned to evacuation orders, I'd volunteered to help move supplies from a temporary clinic to the newer facilities. Charity Hospital wasn't part of the plan, but fate had other ideas. By the time the rain turned to sheets and the wind howled like a living thing, I was already inside. The generator lights cast long, flickering shadows as I moved through the main hall, my footsteps echoing unnaturally. The storm outside sounded like a battering ram, rattling the boarded windows and shaking the very foundation. The plan was simple: grab what I could and get out. But the hospital didn't want to let me go. It started small, things I could brush off if I tried hard enough. A faint rustling sound in the distance, like paper fluttering in a breeze that didn't exist. The smell of antiseptic and decay, stronger than it should have been in a building that had been empty for years. And then there was the cold, a bone-deep chill that seeped into my skin and made my breath fog in the humid air. I was heading toward the pharmacy storage when I saw him. The figure stood at the end of the corridor, his back to me. He wore a hospital gown, the kind I'd seen 1,000 times, thin, pale, patterned with faint blue lines. His frame was gaunt, his shoulders hunched, his head tilted slightly as if listening to something I couldn't hear. "Sir?" I called out, my voice trembling despite myself. He didn't move. I approached cautiously, the beam of my flashlight bouncing off the cracked tiles and stained walls. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" As the words left my mouth, he turned his head slowly, his face obscured by shadow. I felt a jolt of something primal, of fear, yes, but also a strange sense of familiarity, like I'd seen him before. Before I could take another step, he vanished. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. One moment, he was there; the next, the hallway was empty, the silence oppressive. I told myself it was a trick of the light, my imagination running wild in the storm's chaos. But the unease lingered, a gnawing certainty that I wasn't alone. I found the supplies I'd been sent for: bandages, for kits, a few bottles of painkillers, and stuffed them into my bag. The sooner I got out, the better. But as I retraced my steps, the corridors seemed wrong. Longer. Twisting in ways that didn't make sense. Doors that had been closed were now open, revealing darkened rooms filled with rusting beds and broken equipment. And then I heard the voice. "Please. Don't leave me." It was faint, barely audible over the storm, but it stopped me in my tracks. I turned, shining my flashlight into the shadows. The beam caught a glimpse of movement, a figure slipping into a side room. Against every instinct screaming at me to run, I followed. The room was empty, save for a single bed pushed against the far wall. The sheets were old, yellowed with age, but they looked freshly disturbed, as if someone had just been lying there. On the pillow was a faint indentation, the shape of a head. And then I noticed the smell, antiseptic mixed with something sour, something wrong. I stepped closer, and the door slammed shut behind me. I don't remember how long I pounded on that door, shouting for help that wouldn't come. When it finally creaked open on its own, the hallway outside was different. The generator lights had gone out, replaced by a sickly, flickering glow that seemed to come from nowhere. The air felt heavier, each breath a struggle. That's when I saw him again. He was closer this time, standing in the middle of the corridor, his hollow eyes fixed on mine. His lips moved, but the words didn't match the sound that filled the air, low, distorted, like a record playing backward. "Help me," he rasped, his voice layered with something darker, something inhuman. I backed away, but the hallway stretched endlessly behind me. The storm outside had become a dull roar, distant and unimportant. The hospital felt alive, its walls pulsing with a slow, rhythmic beat. The figure stepped toward me, and with every step, the air grew colder, the light dimmer. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking. He didn't answer. Instead, he raised a hand, pointing to the door at the end of the hall. It was the only thing in the building that seemed untouched, clean, white, inviting. I didn't want to go, but I felt my feet moving, drawn by something I couldn't fight. The door led to a small room, sterile and empty except for a single metal gurney. On it lay a clipboard, its pages yellowed and brittle. My name was at the top, followed by a series of dates and notes, all written in the same neat, clinical handwriting. The final entry read, deceased. Time of death, 3:17 a.m. The clock on the wall ticked to 3:16. The figure was behind me now, his breath cold against my neck. "You're the last one," he whispered, his voice almost gentle. "You have to take my place." I spun around, but there was nothing there, just shadows and the sound of my own ragged breathing. The room began to spin, the walls closing in as the clock ticked louder, faster. I fell to my knees, clutching my head, the whispers of countless voices filling my ears. And then, silence. I woke up in the parking lot, the storm gone, the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon. The supplies were still in my bag, but the hospital key I'd been given was missing. When I tried to tell my supervisor what had happened, she just frowned. "Charity Hospital," she said, shaking her head. "We don't go there anymore. It's been locked up for years." But I know what I saw. And every night since, I've woken at 3:17 a.m., the echo of that voice still in my ears, "You're the last one." If you ever find yourself near Charity Hospital, don't go inside. Don't follow the voices, don't look for the patient. Because once you see him, he won't stop until he's free, and you take his place. Story number 9. The lights of the operating room. Working at Bellevue Hospital, I'd grown used to the chaos. Bellevue was a city unto itself, sprawling and labyrinthine, its halls echoing with the cries of the sick and desperate. It was a place of miracles and nightmares, where medicine walked a tightrope between saving lives and losing them. But I never thought I'd find myself fearing its shadows until the night I stayed late. It had been a long shift. A steady stream of emergencies had kept me running, and by the time the ER quieted, I realized I'd left my notes in one of the staff lounges near the old surgical wing. Most of Bellevue's historic areas had been abandoned or repurposed over the years, their outdated facilities replaced by modern technology. Still, the wing remained a hushed part of the hospital, a relic of its darker past. The hallway leading there was deserted, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly. Bellevue never truly slept, but this section felt different, still, quiet, almost expectant. I told myself it was the exhaustion, the late hour, but the knot tightening in my stomach said otherwise. As I turned the corner, I noticed something odd. At the end of the hall, one of the old operating rooms was lit. The frosted glass window on the door glowed with a sterile, bluish light. That didn't make sense, the power to that part of the hospital was supposed to be off. I hesitated, the urge to walk away warring with my curiosity. But curiosity won, as it always does. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound echoing in the stillness. The light inside was blindingly bright, casting sharp shadows across the tiled floor. The room was a snapshot of another era, green tiles, metal cabinets, and an operating table in the center, its leather straps dangling loosely. But it wasn't just the decor that gave me pause. The instruments on the trays weren't clean. They were rusted, stained with something dark and dried. The smell hit me next, coppery and sour, a mix of antiseptic and old blood. My heart pounded as I stepped closer, my shoes squeaking against the tile. And then I saw it. The table wasn't empty. A figure lay on it, covered in a sheet stained with deep, rust-colored splotches. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The shape beneath the sheet was unmistakable, a body, thin and unmoving. For a moment, I thought it was some twisted prank, an old cadaver left by someone with a sick sense of humor. But as I reached for the sheet, the lights flickered. The room changed. Suddenly, I wasn't alone. Shadows filled the room, doctors and nurses, their faces obscured by surgical masks, their hands gloved and bloody. They moved with mechanical precision, passing instruments back and forth as they worked on the figure on the table. The air buzzed with the hum of old equipment, the rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor. But something was wrong. The figure on the table wasn't unconscious. It moved, twitching weakly, its muffled screams barely audible beneath the oxygen mask. I stumbled back, my pulse racing. The doctors didn't acknowledge me, their focus entirely on their grim task. One of them raised a scalpel, the blade glinting in the harsh light. The figure on the table thrashed, the straps holding it down as the scalpel descended. The sound of flesh parting, the wet, sickening squelch, was too much. I turned, grabbing for the door, but it wouldn't budge. Help me. The voice was faint, barely more than a whisper, but it froze me in place. I turned back, my eyes locking onto the figure on the table. Its head turned toward me, its eyes wide and filled with terror. Please, it rasped, the word bubbling out with blood. The shadows turned. The doctors and nurses stopped their work, their masked faces swiveling toward me in unison. Their eyes were hollow, their sockets dark and endless. One of them stepped closer, a bloodied scalpel in hand, the blade trembling as if eager. "You're not supposed to be here," the figure said, its voice low and distorted. I don't remember how I got out. One moment, I was pressed against the door, the shadows closing in, the smell of blood and fear choking me. The next, I was in the hallway, gasping for air, the operating room dark and silent behind me. The light was gone, the hum of the old equipment replaced by the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead. I ran, my footsteps echoing as I put as much distance between myself and that room as possible. When I reached the ER, the bustle of patients and staff felt unreal, like stepping into another world. I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen. Who would believe me? It was just an old room, an empty relic of the past. But I couldn't stop thinking about it, the figure on the table, the shadows, the whispers. I tried to tell myself it was a hallucination, a trick of the mind brought on by exhaustion. But then the dream started. Every night, I'm back in that room. The light is blinding, the smell suffocating. The shadows move with purpose, their hollow eyes watching as I stand frozen, helpless. The figure on the table turns to me, its lips forming the same desperate plea, "Help me." I wake drenched in sweat, the smell of blood lingering in my nostrils, the echoes of the shadows' whispers ringing in my ears. I've started avoiding the hospital, taking shifts at other facilities when I can. But Bellevue doesn't let go. Every time I walk past its looming facade, I feel the pull of that room, the weight of its light pressing against my chest. I've come to understand what I saw that night. The operating room wasn't just a place, it was a memory, a scar left by the horrors committed within its walls. The doctors and nurses, the figure on the table, they're all trapped, caught in an endless loop of suffering and terror. If you ever find yourself at Bellevue Hospital, don't wander too far. Don't let your curiosity guide you to places best left forgotten. And if you see a light where there shouldn't be one, turn around. Because once you step into that room, you might not make it back. And if you do, you'll never be the same.